And now we're going to take some questions from Surge readers. From Phil in London, he asks, will Article 50 be triggered?
Yes, the legislation is literally going through the House of Commons as we speak. It will go through the House of Lords, and it's clear that the Parliament's not going to stand in the way, and that Theresa May will, by fairly early in March, will get the legal authority to invoke Article 50, and Article 50 will be invoked. What, of course, we're then waiting to see is what happens thereafter, but yes, Article 50 is going to be invoked.
Stuart in Edinburgh asked, will voting in general elections one day be conducted through the internet?
Almost undoubtedly not, at least for the foreseeable future. The difficulty and the concern is that you need to have some way of being able to verify that the computer has both recorded and calculated the vote correctly. That requires certainly therefore that the programming for an election done by computer needs to be open source, and no commercial company. Ireland tried to do this, and Ireland had to abandon it because they could not get the companies to do it by open source. There are also, of course, the security concerns about the potential exposure of the internet, and that even when, if you do try to run something by the internet, run by computer, not over the internet, but run by fixed computers, it's pretty common to require a paper trail. We've discovered that the safest way of conducting a ballot is to require people to go to a polling station and fill in a ballot paper in the privacy of a polling booth. All other things, even the introduction of postal voting, which we now do, potentially compromise the integrity of the ballot, and I don't think there is any immediate prospect that we are going to use the internet. There was some experimentation with this about 15, 20 years ago. We also discovered, by the way, it did very little to increase turnout. So given the security concerns, given the experience about turnout on the few occasions when the internet was tried, I don't think there's any immediate prospect of this happening.
Robert in Edinburgh asks, I wonder what he thinks about the notion that MPs should vote for Brexit because the majority did in the referendum. Where does this leave those of us who voted Remain, unrepresented I'd say? I didn't think that was the basis of the parliamentary system.
Yeah, and there is no doubt that the outcome of this referendum does pose a substantial challenge to two of the traditional notions of democracy in the UK. One is that Parliament is sovereign. Parliament can ultimately decides what happens, and the second is that MPs are elected as representatives rather than as delegates. The trouble is the House of Commons and the House of Lords, having decided to pass this legislation, in a sense, it is very difficult for it not to be bound by the result. Now, strictly speaking, this was an advisory referendum. It wasn't a binding referendum, unlike, for example, the referendum on the alternative vote 5 years ago. But the truth is, politically, I mean, you think about it, given that 52% of the population did vote to leave, if the UK Parliament and the UK government were now not to implement that instruction, I think you could anticipate that, first of all, there will be a substantial increase in support for UKIP, and two, that an MP would suffer seriously at the ballot box at the next election, and therefore almost inevitably, having decided to hold this referendum, the House of Commons finds itself bound. Is it satisfactory? I think one could argue that the unsatisfactory nature of this referendum is that usually we have been, insofar as we've used referendums in the UK, and it's a relatively recent experience, we've used them in order to vote on a proposed change or not, for which at least there maybe isn't full legislative detail, but at least there is a prospectus, such as in the Scottish independence referendum. The difficult thing about this referendum, of course, is that this was a government trying to use a referendum to reinforce the status quo, and therefore there wasn't a proposition of what the change envisaged. This is why we're now having this argument, well, what does Brexit mean? Because nobody was required to spell out exactly what Brexit means. There was no clear proposition of what we might try to seek from the EU. One could argue that that was unsatisfactory, but that's an argument not about the fact that what we've done is to cut across notions of representative democracy. It's an argument about whether or not it's satisfactory to hold a referendum when the prospectus for change as well as the prospectus for status quo has not been clearly specified.
Matt asks, why have the polls been so wrong in the last few years after such a long period of accuracy?
Neither part of that question is correct. There is a long-standing problem with opinion polls in the UK, and that is that they have a persistent tendency to overestimate Labour and underestimate Conservative support. The problem clearly arose in 1992, and although it was never as serious thereafter, there was a tendency in pretty much every general election since for that pattern still to be present, and then it returned in 2015 in spades. The lesson that we have is that almost undoubtedly this is to do with difficulties of sampling, of trying to get hold of a representative sample of people in a relatively short period of time. And the pollsters have long known that this is difficult. What we discovered in 2015 is that there are various attempts in which they engaged through weighting their data in order to try to make it representative weren't adequate. But that is a one-off event. Now, it is true, most voters presumed that Remain were going to win the referendum. But that is not an expectation that you can defend on the basis of what the opinion polls were telling you. During the EU referendum, there were actually more opinion polls that put Leave ahead than put Remain ahead. And if you look at those polls that were done over the internet throughout the whole of the referendum campaign, from as early as September 2015, they said it was too close to call. The truth is there's an awful lot of people looking at the polls that they wanted to believe were true, disregarding those that they don't, and also an assumption that at the end of the day the polls would be wrong, that they would underestimate the Remain vote, and you can suggest reasons why that might be the case. Therefore, they presume Remain would win. Equally, when you come to the US, where people say, oh, the polls got it wrong, well, actually, on average, the national opinion polls in the US said that Hillary Clinton was about 3 points ahead, and in the end she was about 2 points ahead. We should not blame the opinion polls for the peculiarities of the US Electoral College. It is true there's then some interesting things to say about what happened in the statewide polls, but if you looked at the statewide polls intelligently, even then you knew that they were not saying that Hillary Clinton clearly had 270 Electoral College votes in the bag. So I would say to you that certainly so far as Trump and so far as the EU referendum is concerned, the record of the polls is much more nuanced than people realise, and people are frankly not looking at the evidence closely enough. 2015, yes, a problem, and part of a longer term problem. That's where I think there is an issue. The polls in the US frankly weren't any worse than they were actually slightly better than they were in the previous US presidential election. And given the very substantial difficulties of polling the EU referendum, because it was a very, very different kind of contest with the electorate divided in a very, very different way, and with votes not going across party lines, I mean, this was a very tough referendum for the polls. They could have been better, but they weren't as bad as people think.